Picture this horrifying scene unfolding on the blood-soaked beaches of Troy. 12 young men kneel in the dirt, hands bound brutally behind their backs, with leather thongs that cut into their wrists. They are not battle-hardened soldiers who chose this fate. They are the terrified sons of Trojan nobility boys, barely old enough to grow beards, torn from their families' palaces. Towering over them like death itself is Achilles, the greatest warrior the Bronze Age world has ever seen. He doesn't make a dramatic speech about honor or justice. He doesn't hesitate or show mercy. He grabs the first boy roughly by his hair, yanks back his head to expose the throat, and slits it open with a bronze sword in one practiced motion. The blood sprays hot across the sand. He drags the twitching body, still convulsing in death, to the massive funeral pyre, burning for his dead friend, and throws it onto the flames like firewood. The smell of burning flesh fills the air. Then he turns back methodically for the second boy, who is screaming and begging. Then the third, who has soiled himself in terror. He slaughters all 12 like cattle in a slaughterhouse, working his way down the line to vent his grief through blood. This is not the golden-haired hero from Hollywood movies. This is a war criminal, committing a ritualized human sacrifice. This is the brutal, unfiltered truth about Achilles. Before we dive into this story of rage, glory, and the price of immortality, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles for more forgotten truths that challenge what you think you know about ancient heroes. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It's incredible. We're exploring Bronze Age psychology together across millennia, connected by our shared need to understand what drives humans to violence. Now let's examine the blood on his hands and ask the uncomfortable question: why did Homer include this massacre in the Iliad? Homer included this scene for a specific, calculated reason. He wanted to show his audience that Achilles had fundamentally ceased to be human. To the ancient Greeks who first heard this poem sung in firelit halls, mistreating a corpse or performing human sacrifice was a religious taboo of the highest order, a pollution of the soul that could anger the gods. But Achilles didn't care anymore. By this point in the decade-long war, he operated beyond the laws of gods and men. The epic poem actually begins with a specific, chilling warning about what's coming. The very first word of the entire Iliad is menace, usually translated as rage or wrath, but that English word is far too soft to capture the meaning. Menace is cosmic wrath, a divine fury usually reserved only for Zeus hurling lightning bolts or Apollo sending plague arrows. When a mortal human harnesses menace, civilization itself cracks like pottery dropped on stone. The story of Achilles is simply the documentation of that crack spreading wider and wider until it shatters everything. For 9 grinding years before this moment, the Greek army had rotted on the beaches of Troy like a corpse in the sun. They were not a unified nation fighting for freedom. They were a loose coalition of pirate kings raiding the coastline for gold, slaves, and women. Disease swept through the cramped camp regularly. Morale collapsed and rebuilt and collapsed again. The siege dragged on endlessly. In this chaotic, brutal context, Achilles served as the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. He didn't just fight in battles, he exterminated populations. He led the Myrmidons, an elite shock troop unit that moved faster and struck harder than any other Greek phalanx. But the man we see butchering 12 boys at a funeral pyre was not born a monster. He was systematically made into one through childhood trauma. We need to shatter a popular myth right now, the version you probably know. The story goes that his mother, Thetis, dipped baby Achilles in the river Styx, holding him by the heel, making him invulnerable everywhere except that one spot. That's a Roman invention added many centuries later to make the story more palatable for children, to give his death a simple explanation. The original Greek myths tell a much darker, more disturbing version of his origin. His mother Thetis did not use magical water. She used fire. Thetis was a sea nymph who had been forced to marry a mortal man. She despised the mortality she sensed in her infant son. She saw his human flesh as a defect that needed to be burned out. So every night while her husband slept, she took the baby Achilles and buried him in the red-hot embers of the palace hearth. She let the fire burn his infant skin, deliberately attempting to purge the human weakness out of him and replace it with divine endurance. She was forging a child like a blacksmith forges a sword through heat and pain. His father Peleus walked in on this horrifying ritual one night. He saw his wife roasting their screaming infant son alive in the fireplace and snatched the boy away in horror. But the psychological lesson had already been imprinted. From infancy, Achilles learned that love looked like violence. He learned that to be special, to be worthy, you had to endure burning pain. This wasn't a childhood of nurturing and play. It was an assembly line for manufacturing a killer. To finish the job of creating the perfect warrior, his father sent him away to the wilderness. He didn't go to a prestigious academy to study philosophy and poetry. He went to Mount Pelion to live with Chiron, the centaur, half man, half horse, living in caves. Forget the wise, gentle teacher figure you might expect from Disney. Chiron fed the growing boy a strict, deliberate diet, the raw intestines of lions and the marrow of wild boars. Ancient Greek logic followed the rules of sympathetic magic. You literally become what you consume. By eating the raw organs of apex predators, young Achilles absorbed their aggression on a cellular level. He absorbed their lack of mercy, their killer instinct. He grew up sleeping on hard ground, hunting bears on foot with just a spear, and viewing empathy as a dangerous liability that would get you killed. By the time messengers arrived announcing the Trojan War, the Greek kings weren't recruiting a hero to lead their armies. They were recruiting a weapon of mass destruction. He had the body of a god, tall, impossibly fast, stronger than any normal man, but he had the emotional maturity of a severely stunted child, driven by a desperate, all-consuming need for eternal glory, fame that would outlive death. He knew the prophecy about his fate. The fates had given him a choice: go to Troy and die young but famous, remembered forever in song, or stay home, marry, have children, and die old and forgotten in a warm bed. He chose blood and glory without hesitation. But as we watch him now tossing those 12 Trojan boys onto the funeral fire one by one, we see the reality of that choice. He didn't just sacrifice his life expectancy for glory. He sacrificed his entire humanity, and the worst violence was yet to come. To understand the absolute terror Achilles inspired on the battlefield, we need to examine the tools of his trade in detail. Forget the gleaming, silver-plated steel swords you see in Hollywood blockbusters like Troy. The Trojan War was fought in the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. This was a world of soft metal and primitive metallurgy. When two armies collided on the plains of Troy, the sound was duller, heavier than you imagine. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. It bends under stress. It dents easily. It requires constant maintenance, straightening after every single skirmish. A bronze sword strike didn't slice cleanly like a steel katana. It bludgeoned and crushed, leaving ragged wounds. The armor of the period, like the famous dendropanoply found by archaeologists in Greece, was not a fitted suit of medieval plate that allowed free movement. It was a clumsy, lobster-like casing of hammered bronze sheets that severely restricted movement and cooked the man inside like an oven under the Mediterranean sun. Men regularly died of heat stroke inside their own armor. But Achilles moved differently than everyone else. The Iliad describes his gear with obsessive, loving detail, distinguishing him from the clumsy conscripts stumbling around him. His lethality began with his signature spear. In the Greek text, it's called the Pelion Ash, named after Mount Pelion where he trained. This wasn't a standard-issue pike that every soldier carried. It was a massive shaft of dense ashwood personally cut from the summit of that mountain. the same wild peak where he'd eaten lion intestines as a boy. And Homer makes a specific point to tell us the physics of this weapon that sets Achilles apart. The spear was so incredibly heavy, so dense, that no other Greek hero could even lift it, let alone fight with it. Not Agamemnon, the High King. Not the giant Ajax, tallest man in the army. Not the clever Odysseus. Only Achilles possessed the strength to wield it. Think carefully about the combat mechanics of that detail. In a one-on-one duel, while other men are jabbing with light willow wood spears that might snap against a shield, Achilles is thrusting a heavy beam of timber tipped with sharpened bronze. When that concentrated mass hits a shield at speed, it doesn't just pierce the wood, it shatters the arm holding it, breaks bones, knocks men off their feet. He wasn't fencing with opponents, he was battering them into submission with superior kinetic energy and physics. Then there were his soldiers, the Myrmidons. A general is only as effective as his vanguard, and Achilles commanded the most feared unit in the Greek army. Greek mythology claims these men were originally ants transformed into humans by Zeus to repopulate a plague-devastated island. It's a convenient fairy tale, but the truth is likely more disturbing. The Ant-Man metaphor perfectly describes their tactical behavior on the battlefield. In an era of chaotic, disorganized tribal warfare, where most battles devolved into confused brawls, the Myrmidons fought with insect-like hive mind discipline. They were professional shock troops recruited from the rugged, mountainous region of Thessaly in northern Greece. They didn't break formation when things got hard. They swarmed targets, while other Greek kings like Menelaus commanded loose levies of farmers and fishermen who just wanted to survive and go home. Achilles led what we'd recognize as a professional private army. They were the Bronze Age equivalent of Navy SEALs' elite special forces. They moved in eerie silence. They followed their commander's rhythm perfectly. When Achilles charged into battle, the Myrmidons surged like a black tide of death behind him, creating a devastating force multiplier that could break any Trojan defensive line. We also need to talk about what they looked like, because it was psychologically important. It wasn't just shining bronze that struck fear. The archaeological record gives us a detail far more terrifying than polished metal. Many warriors of this era, including Odysseus and likely the Myrmidons, wore helmets constructed from boar tusks. To make a single functional helmet, a hunter had to kill 40 or 50 wild boars and harvest their tusks. Think about the visual psychological signal that sends across a battlefield. When you stared across the dusty plain at a phalanx of Myrmidons advancing in perfect formation, you weren't looking at shiny decorative crests. You were looking at thousands of dead animal teeth, rows upon rows of ivory trophies, harvested from dangerous beasts, stitched onto leather caps. It signaled clearly that these men were apex predators, hunters who killed for a living. Achilles led this pack of wolves. He didn't fight for abstract patriotism or the honor of rescuing Helen. He fought because violence was the only economy he understood, the only language he spoke fluently. Before the siege of Troy settled into the grinding 10-year stalemate we know from the Iliad, Achilles systematically decimated the surrounding region like Sherman's march through Georgia. He sacked 23 cities total, 12 coastal cities accessible by ship, and 11 inland towns. He turned the war into a profitable business for himself. He raided livestock, burned villages to ash, and sold the captured women into slavery. This was the reality of Bronze Age heroism. It was piracy on a grand scale, organized theft with swords. This relentless raiding built his fearsome legend across the Aegean, but it also sowed the seeds of his eventual destruction. He wasn't just accumulating gold and bronze, he was accumulating time honor. In ancient Greek warrior culture, time meant honor, but it wasn't abstract or spiritual. It was physical, tangible. You measured a man's honor by the literal pile of loot in his tent and the number of captured slave girls in his bed. If someone took away your loot, they didn't just steal your property. They publicly erased your honor, your social status. They socially castrated you in front of the entire army. This is the critical cultural context for understanding what happens next in the story. Achilles is a man who has been psychologically conditioned from infancy to express himself through killing. He's armed with a spear no one else can even lift. He's leading a death squad of disciplined ant-men, and he's operating on a violent economy where honor equals plunder. He's a powder keg of rage waiting for a single spark. And that spark wouldn't come from a Trojan enemy sword. It would come from his own commander-in-chief. Over the one thing Achilles valued more than blood, his prize woman, his proof of status. But before the Myrmidons, before the mountain of looted gold, before the title of best of the Greeks, the world's greatest killer tried desperately to be invisible. There's a bizarre, uncomfortable chapter in the Achilles story that often gets glossed over in adaptations because it doesn't fit the hypermasculine image of the ultimate warrior. Just months before the Greek fleet launched for Troy, Achilles wasn't sharpening his spear or training his men. He was wearing a dress and hiding in a harem on the remote island of Scyros. His mother, Thetis, absolutely terrified by the prophecy that her son would die young at Troy, smuggled him secretly into the court of King Lycomedes. She disguised him as a girl, gave him the female name Pyrrha, and hid him among the king's many daughters. Imagine the psychological tension of this situation. You have a young man who was raised on raw lion intestines and wild boar marrow, a boy who has been physically conditioned since infancy to shatter bones and kill bears. Now he's forced to sit still in silk robes, weaving wool at a loom, and making polite conversation about absolutely nothing. He was a wolf, trying desperately to pass as a sheep among actual sheep. It was an impossible acting job. The assembled Greek kings knew they couldn't conquer Troy without him. The prophecies were clear, so they sent their master manipulator, Odysseus, to hunt him down. Odysseus knew he couldn't just knock on the palace door and demand Achilles. He needed an elaborate trap. He needed to trigger the boy's deepest instincts. Odysseus arrived at the palace, posing as a traveling merchant with exotic wares to sell. He laid out his merchandise in the great hall for the king's daughters to inspect and admire. On one side of the display table, he carefully spread out expensive jewelry, fine perfumes, and luxurious textiles, the expected desires of sheltered royal women. On the other side, hidden slightly beneath the fabrics, he placed a few items of high-quality weaponry, a sturdy bronze shield, and a razor-sharp spear. The genuine princesses immediately flocked to the jewelry like moths to flame. They held up the necklaces to the light, laughing and admiring the crafted gold. But one girl stood conspicuously apart from the group. The disguised Achilles drifted slowly toward the weapons side of the table. His hands didn't reach for the perfume bottles. They hovered, unconsciously, over the grip of the sword. His entire body language betrayed him, shoulders tensing, weight shifting forward. The muscle memory of a trained warrior was screaming to be released. Then Odysseus signaled his hidden men waiting outside. They suddenly blew a war trumpet, a deafening blast that signaled an immediate attack on the palace. Panic erupted in the hall. The real princesses screamed in terror and fled for cover, hiding behind pillars. But Pyrrha didn't run away from danger. In a heartbeat, he stripped off his disguise, seized the shield and spear from the table, and aggressively scanned the room for enemies, ready to kill. The carefully maintained mask fell away completely. The predator revealed himself. Odysseus stepped forward, grabbed his arm, and smiled knowingly. "The draft dodging is over, Achilles. It's time to go to war." This revealing moment is crucial because it crystallizes the central tragedy of Achilles' entire existence. He had a genuine way out. He was completely safe on Scyros, hidden. He could have chosen the long, peaceful life, the other half of the prophecy. He could have married one of those princesses, raised children, and died an old, anonymous man in a warm bed, surrounded by family. But the moment the war trumpet sounded, his fundamental nature made the choice for him automatically. He was biologically, psychologically incapable of cowardice or hiding. He boarded Odysseus's ship, knowing exactly what it meant. He wasn't sailing to a victory parade or glorious triumph. He was sailing directly to his own funeral. He knew it, and he went anyway. Once the Greek fleet landed on the beaches of Troy, the countdown clock started ticking. For 9 long, grinding years, Achilles suppressed the knowledge of his impending death by burying himself completely in the violence we discussed earlier. He became the systematic sacker of cities, the unstoppable engine of the Greek war effort. But the psychological tension between his mortal fate and his divine rage was building pressure. He was doing all the dangerous work, taking all the deadly risks, and winning the war single-handedly for Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae. Agamemnon was a politician and bureaucrat, a man who commanded safely from the back of the army, yet claimed the lion's share of glory and plunder. This toxic dynamic, the bitter resentment between the talent in the field and the management in the tent, is timeless. It happens in modern corporations. It happened in the Bronze Age. And it brings us directly to the inciting incident of the Iliad, the spark that ignites everything. The trigger wasn't military strategy or disputed territory. It was a woman named Briseis. But we must not mistake this for a romance novel or love story. In the brutal context of the ancient world, Briseis was not Achilles' girlfriend or beloved. She was a war prize, a trophy. She was a living medal of honor, publicly awarded to Achilles by the assembled army in recognition of his achievements. She was the physical, tangible proof of his time, his honor. When Agamemnon, in a fit of petty insecurity after losing his own prize woman, decided to seize Briseis for himself, he didn't just break Achilles' heart romantically. He broke the fundamental social contract of the entire army. He told Achilles publicly, "Your achievements mean nothing. Your value is 0. Everything you've won belongs to me." For a man who had consciously chosen death over life just to be remembered, just to have his achievements recognized, this was the ultimate insult. The beast that Odysseus had unleashed on Scyros was about to turn its teeth away from the Trojans and snap viciously at its own masters. When Achilles stopped fighting, the war didn't just stall, it reversed catastrophically. The Iliad devotes massive sections to the days immediately following his withdrawal from combat, painting a detailed picture of absolute catastrophe for the Greeks. Without the Myrmidons anchoring the defensive line, the entire Greek formation lost its spine. The Trojans, who had spent years cowering behind their massive walls whenever Achilles was visible on the field, suddenly realized with growing confidence that the predator was gone. They opened the Scaean gates and poured out like water from a broken dam. Leading them with newfound confidence was Hector, crown prince of Troy. We need to talk seriously about Hector. In modern pop culture adaptations, he's often portrayed as the unambiguous good guy, the noble family man defending his home and his people. And while that interpretation is true, Homer's text reveals a different, more complex side of Hector during these crucial days. Without Achilles there to check his advance, Hector transformed into an unstoppable juggernaut. He wasn't just defending Troy's walls anymore. He was hunting Greeks for sport. He drove the invading army back across the Trojan plain, mile by bloody mile, forcing them into a humiliating retreat toward their beached ships. The military situation grew so desperately bad that the Greeks had to do something unprecedented in the entire 9-year war. They stopped attacking completely and started building defensive fortifications. They hastily constructed a massive wooden wall and dug a deep trench around their own ships, their only escape route. Think about the profound humiliation of that reversal. The invaders who came confidently to lay siege to a great city were now besieged themselves, trapped on the edge of the ocean with nowhere to run. Inside the camp of the Myrmidons, The atmosphere was psychologically suffocating. Imagine being a member of the world's most elite special forces unit, sitting idle and polishing your shield while listening to your allies being slaughtered just a few hundred yards away. You can hear the screams. You can smell the blood on the wind. Achilles sat in his tent playing a lyre, singing songs of ancient glory, while the smell of burning Greek corpses wafted in on the sea breeze. This was the calculated height of his strike, his political protest. It was cold, deliberate, passive aggression. He was consciously letting his fellow soldiers die, men he had eaten with, men he had sailed with across the Aegean, just to prove to Agamemnon that he was absolutely indispensable. It was passive aggression on a genocidal scale. The turning point came when the Trojan advance became completely unstoppable. Hector smashed through the hastily built Greek fortifications with a massive stone, shattering the wooden gates. The Trojans flooded into the camp like a tsunami. Torch in hand, Hector lunged desperately for the ships themselves. This was the nightmare scenario the Greeks had feared for 9 years. If the ships burned, they had no way home across the sea. They would be trapped in hostile territory, destined for slavery or execution. The black smoke billowed into the sky, visible even from the distant Myrmidon camp. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion since childhood, could take the slaughter no longer. He watched the destruction of the army and openly wept. He begged Achilles desperately, "If you won't fight because of your pride, at least let me fight in your place. Let me wear your distinctive armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle. If the Trojans see your helmet on the field, they'll think you've returned, and they'll run in terror." Achilles looked at the fire consuming the ships on the horizon. His wounded pride still wouldn't let him personally fight for Agamemnon, but his possessiveness over his legacy and reputation allowed a compromise. He agreed to let Patroclus play the part of Achilles. He gave Patroclus his armor, that terrifying bronze casing that everyone in both armies knew on sight. He gave him command of the Myrmidons, but he gave him one strict, specific order, a command that would seal both their fates. Drive them from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not rob me of my glory by winning without me. It was a warning given purely in selfishness, but disguised as concern for Patroclus's safety. Patroclus donned the armor piece by piece. He strapped on the bronze greaves. He fitted the heavy breastplate. He placed the helmet with the horsehair crest on his head. But there was one piece of Achilles' equipment he physically could not take, the Pelian ash spear. The massive spear remained in its rack. Patroclus wasn't strong enough to lift it. He took a lesser, lighter spear instead. He rallied the Ant-Men with a speech, and they charged out of the camp in formation. The psychological effect was immediate and electric. The Trojans, seeing the distinctive silhouette of their nightmare returning to the battlefield, panicked instantly. They genuinely thought the Reaper had returned to kill them. They broke rank and fled in terror. Patroclus, intoxicated by the sudden rush of power, by the adrenaline of leading the most lethal military unit in the world, forgot Achilles' warning completely. He didn't stop at the ships, as ordered. He chased the fleeing Trojans across the entire plain, slaughtering them by the dozen, driving them right back to the shadow of Troy's great walls. He was winning decisively. For a brief moment, he felt like a god of war, until he wasn't. In the dust and chaos beneath the walls, Patroclus pushed too far into enemy territory. He encountered a force he couldn't handle. Apollo, the god who favored Troy, struck him from behind invisibly, knocking the helmet from his head. The deception was over in an instant. Everyone suddenly saw it wasn't Achilles. Then came Euphorbus, a young Trojan warrior who stabbed Patroclus in the back. And finally, Hector appeared. Hector finished the job with a spear thrust to Patroclus's belly. As Patroclus lay dying in the dirt, gasping out his last words through the pain, he warned Hector that his victory was hollow and temporary. that death was already standing behind him in the form of Achilles' coming rage. But the most dangerous moment wasn't Patroclus's death itself. It was the message. A runner sprinted from the battlefield toward the tent where Achilles waited, carrying the news that would shatter the world and unleash hell. The strike was over. The slaughter was about to begin. When the messenger Antilochus delivered the devastating news, "Patroclus is dead," Achilles did not rage immediately. He collapsed. The Iliad describes a scene of primal, animalistic devastation. The strongest man alive fell to the ground like a felled tree, clawing desperately at the earth with his hands. He poured black dust over his golden hair and deliberately defiled his face with filth and ash. He lay there sprawled like a fallen statue. The text describes him as mighty in his mightiness, occupying so much physical space, even in grief, that he seemed larger than human. This wasn't just sadness or mourning. It was a total psychological amputation. Patroclus and Achilles were not just comrades or fellow soldiers. They were two halves of one soul. In some versions, they were lovers. With Patroclus gone, the human half of Achilles died. What remained was something less than human pure rage given form. But grief in the Bronze Age was extremely dangerous, especially for warriors. While Achilles wept on the ground, the Trojans were still fighting viciously over Patroclus's corpse on the battlefield. They wanted to drag it back to Troy, cut off the head, and mount it on a spike as a trophy. Hector had already stripped the body of its armor. He was now wearing Achilles' own divine bronze, the armor gifted by the gods to Achilles' father Peleus. Think about the psychological horror of that image. To fight Hector now, Achilles would have to strike at his own silhouette. He would have to stab through his own breastplate. But Achilles had an immediate problem. He was completely unarmed. He had no armor, no spear, no shield. He was naked and vulnerable to the enemy. But his rage was so potent, so overwhelming, that he didn't need steel or bronze. He rose from the dust like a corpse standing up. He walked slowly to the edge of the Greek defensive trench. He didn't cross it. He didn't enter the battle. He just stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun. Homer tells us that the goddess Athena draped a golden cloud around his head and ignited it supernaturally so that flames seemed to pour from his scalp like a torch. And then he screamed. He didn't shout a command to rally troops. He didn't call for revenge. He released a completely inarticulate war cry, a roar. It was a sound so terrifying, so fundamentally unnatural and inhuman, that instant chaos erupted in the Trojan ranks. Charioteers lost control of their panicking horses. Soldiers turned and trampled each other in blind terror, in the sheer panic caused by the sound of his voice alone. Before he'd lifted a finger to fight, 12 Trojan soldiers died, impaled on their own spears or crushed by their own chariots. He hadn't touched anyone. He had simply announced his return. The Trojans, absolutely terrified, abandoned Patroclus's body and fled behind their walls. The sun went down, ending the day's fighting. But the night that followed was sleepless for everyone in both camps. Back in his tent, Achilles refused to wash the blood and dust from his skin. He refused to eat food. He refused to sleep. He swore a terrible oath that he would not bury Patroclus until he had brought back the severed head of Hector and the heads of 12 Trojan nobles to sacrifice. The beast was fully awake now and hungry, but he still needed armor to fight. Thetis, weeping for her doomed son, went to the only being in the cosmos capable of forging gear fit for a demigod, Hephaestus, the divine smith of the gods who worked in volcanic forges. What Hephaestus created that night was not just protective equipment for defense. It was a masterpiece of tragic irony. The shield of Achilles is famous in Western literature, but its deeper meaning is often missed. On its surface, the god hammered out a panorama of the entire world, everything Achilles was about to leave behind. He depicted the earth, the sky, and the sea. He created 2 cities of men in detail. one at peace, filled with weddings, dancing, and fair law courts, and one at war, filled with ambushes and strife. He depicted fields of plowed earth, ready for harvest, vineyards heavy with grapes, and young people singing and celebrating life. He put the entire beautiful world that Achilles was consciously about to abandon onto the shield he would carry into his final battles. When Achilles received the new armor the next morning, the other Myrmidons were literally afraid to look at it. The supernatural sheen of the divine metal was too bright, too painful to see. Only Achilles could look directly at it, without blinking. His eyes, the poet says, flared like blowtorches burning with rage. He strapped on the greaves. He fitted the breastplate. He picked up the massive shield that held the images of the life he was consciously rejecting: marriage, harvest, peace, normalcy. He was carrying the world he could never have on his arm as he went to destroy. Then he went to the stables. He yoked his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius, divine gifts. In a moment of supernatural dread and prophecy, Hera gave the horse Xanthus the temporary power of human speech. The animal turned its head and warned him directly. "We will save you today, mighty Achilles. We will carry you safely through battle. But your day of death is near. It's coming soon." Achilles didn't even blink at the prophecy. He answered the speaking horse with cold, absolute fury. "Why do you prophesy my death, Xanthus? I know it well already. I know I'm destined to die here, far from my father and mother. But I will not stop fighting until I've given the Trojans their fill of blood." He mounted the war chariot. He wasn't a soldier anymore following orders. He was a force of nature, a dead man walking, actively seeking company for his grave. The slaughter that was about to unfold would make the previous 9 years of war look like a minor skirmish. The river was waiting. Achilles cut the fleeing Trojan army in half like a knife. He drove one panic-stricken group toward the city walls, but he deliberately herded the other half-thousands of men into the deep, swirling waters of the river Scamander. What followed was not a battle by any definition. It was an industrial liquidation, a mechanized slaughter. Achilles leaped into the water with only his sword. The Iliad describes the scene with gruesome, visceral clarity. The water turned dark crimson almost instantly. The sounds of screaming men and the violent splashing of water echoed off the canyon walls. He moved through the river like a thresher shark in a bait bowl, hacking at anything that moved. There was no strategy here, no tactical thinking, only the mechanical, repetitive motion of slaughter. In the middle of this ongoing carnage, a young Trojan prince named Lycaon crawled out of the bloody mud and desperately grabbed Achilles' knees in the traditional posture of supplication. He begged frantically for his life. He offered a massive ransom. His family was wealthy. In any other phase of the war, any other day, a Greek hero would have gladly accepted the gold and spared the boy. Prisoners were valuable. But Achilles was no longer operating on the logic of commerce or profit. He looked down at the terrified, shaking boy and delivered one of the most chilling speeches in all of Western literature. "Come, friend, you too must die. Why moan about it so? Even Patroclus died, a far, far better man than you. And look, you see how handsome and powerful I am, the son of a great father with a goddess for a mother? Even I have death waiting for me. There will come a dawn or a sunset or a high noon when someone will take my life in battle too. So die." He didn't kill Lycaon out of anger or hatred. He killed him out of nihilistic camaraderie. We're all going to die. So what does it matter? He slashed the boy's throat and threw his body into the current for the fish to eat. But the slaughter was too efficient. The sheer volume of corpses clogged the river channels. The water stopped flowing. Dead bodies created dams. This brings us to the most surreal moment in Greek mythology. The river itself woke up. In the ancient Greek mind, landscape was alive. Mountains, rivers, trees, all had spirits. The river god Scamander, literally choked by the blood and bodies blocking his flow, rose up in human form to confront the killer polluting his waters. He roared at Achilles to stop filling his beautiful channels with corpses. Achilles, arrogant and blood-drunk, told the god to get out of his way. The river attacked. A massive wave, dark with gore and debris, rose up and crashed down on the hero. This wasn't a metaphor. Homer describes a physical wrestling match between a mortal man and a force of nature. The currents battered Achilles violently, dragging him under, stripping the ground from beneath his feet. The water beat against his shield, trying to drown the fire that burned inside him. For the first time in his life, Achilles felt genuine fear. He didn't fear Hector. He didn't fear swords or spears. He feared an ignoble death, drowning like a swineherd boy in a muddy ditch, erased by water without glory, without witnesses, without song. He screamed to the heavens, blaming his mother for lying to him about his fate, begging not to die wet and obscure and forgotten. The gods intervened to save their favorite killer. Hera sent Hephaestus to rescue him. The smith god turned his divine flamethrowers on the river itself. It was elemental warfare, fire against water. The plains of Troy caught fire. The elms and willows lining the riverbanks incinerated. The water boiled. Fish floated to the surface cooked. The river god, scalded and steaming, finally surrendered in agony. Achilles climbed out of the boiling mud. He was steamed, scorched, and covered head to toe in blood and ash. But he was alive, and now there was nothing standing between him and the walls of Troy. The river had failed to stop him. The army had failed. Only one man remained outside the city gates, waiting. Hector. Hector stood alone outside the Scaean gates. His parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, screamed from the ramparts above, tearing their hair, begging him to come inside to safety. They saw what was coming across the plain. It wasn't a man anymore. It was a calamity wrapped in divine armor, shining like the star Sirius the dog star, the star of disaster and doom. But Hector didn't move. His pride pinned him to the spot like a nail. He had led the Trojans to disaster the day before, when Patroclus died. He couldn't face the shame of retreating now in front of his entire city. Achilles closed the distance. The wind howled. The stage was set for the final duel of the Bronze Age. This is the moment Hollywood always gets completely wrong. In movies like Troy, Achilles versus Hector is portrayed as a stoic, honorable duel between equally matched swordsmen, a dance of skill. In the Iliad, it's a hunt. When Achilles charged, the greatest defender of Troy did not brace his shield and prepare to fight. He broke. Absolute panic seized Hector's limbs. The sheer radiating aura of violence and death coming from Achilles was too much for the human mind to withstand. Hector turned and ran for his life. This isn't a critique of his bravery. It's a testament to Achilles' monstrosity. He had become something beyond human that inspired primal terror. They ran around the entire circumference of the walls of Troy 3 times. Imagine the profound humiliation. The king of Troy, the queen, and all the citizens watched from the ramparts as their champion, their savior, sprinted desperately for his life, like a frightened deer, pursued by a nightmare in divine armor. Achilles chased him in complete silence, forbidding his men to fire arrows with hand signals. He gestured with his head. He is mine. No one touches him but me. Hector only stopped running because he was tricked by the gods. The goddess Athena, wanting to end the war, disguised herself as Hector's brother Deiphobus. She appeared beside him, breathless, promising to stand and fight by his side. Emboldened by this false hope of support, Hector finally turned to face his pursuer. He tried desperately to negotiate terms. He offered a civilized pact. If I kill you, I will strip your armor as is customary, but I will return your body to the Greeks for proper burial. Promise me you will do the same for me. Achilles looked at him with completely dead eyes. His response is the perfect definition of hatred. Don't talk to me of pacts, you madman. There are no treaties between men and lions. There are no pacts between wolves and lambs. One of us will glut the god of war with his blood today." The fight was brutally short. Hector threw his spear with all his strength. It bounced harmlessly off Hephaestus's shield. He turned to his brother for a spare weapon, but the brother was gone. The illusion vanished. Hector realized in a cold wash of horror that the gods had abandoned him. He was alone. He drew his sword for a final desperate charge. Achilles knew the armor Hector was wearing intimately. It was his own old armor, stripped from Patroclus's corpse. He knew its weak points perfectly. As Hector charged, Achilles drove his massive ash spear into the small gap at the collarbone, right through the tender flesh of the neck. Hector fell hard. He didn't die instantly. He lay in the dust, gasping, blood filling his throat, begging once more for his body to be returned to his parents for proper burial. Achilles stood over him and whispered, "I only wish I had the stomach to hack your meat off and eat it raw for what you've done to me." Hector died, predicting Achilles' own death at the hands of Paris and Apollo. Achilles pulled his spear out and said flatly, "Die. I will accept my own death whenever Zeus wills it." Then began the desecration that shocked even the Greeks. Killing Hector wasn't enough for the rage. It demanded more. Achilles stripped the body naked. Then, in front of Hector's screaming parents watching from the wall, he took a knife and slit the tendons behind Hector's ankles between the heel and the bone. He threaded leather straps through the bloody holes and tied the corpse to the back of his chariot. He whipped the horses. The chariot lurched forward. The head of the Prince of Troy, once accustomed to soft pillows, slammed into the hard earth. Achilles dragged him all the way back to the Greek ships, a trail of blood in the dust. And he didn't stop there. For 12 days straight, every single morning, Achilles woke up, tied the body to his chariot, and dragged it 3 times around the tomb of Patroclus. He wanted to erase Hector physically. He wanted to grind the man into paste, to obliterate him. Apollo, pitying the dead prince, used his divine power to wrap the body in an invisible golden shield of protection, preventing the skin from ripping and the dogs from eating it. But the intent remained clear. This was the nadir of Achilles' soul. He had conquered Troy's greatest warrior, but in doing so, he had become something less than human. He was a creature of pure hate, trapped in a cycle of grief that no amount of blood could wash away. The Greeks watched in uncomfortable silence. This wasn't war anymore. It was madness. For 12 days, Achilles existed in a fugue state of violence and grief. But the gods had finally seen enough. Zeus sent a direct message. The body must be returned. This ends now. Across the battle lines, King Priam of Troy prepared for what he knew was a suicide mission. He loaded a wagon with gold, fine fabrics, and bronze cauldrons, a ransom fit for a prince. Then, under the cover of darkness, and guided by the god Hermes in disguise, the old man drove straight into the Greek camp. He bypassed the sentries. He bypassed the trench where the massacre had taken place. He walked right up to the door of the lodge where the man who murdered his son sat eating his dinner. Priam entered alone, unarmed. The Myrmidons froze. They stared at this old man, appearing like a ghost in the torchlight. Before Achilles could reach for a weapon, Priam did the unthinkable. He dropped to his knees. He reached out and grabbed the hands of Achilles, the very hands that had slaughtered so many of his children, and he kissed them. This gesture broke the entire universe of the Iliad. In a war defined by pride and retaliation, absolute humility was the only weapon left untried. Priam didn't ask for mercy. He asked for empathy. He looked up at the killer and said, "Think of your father, O Achilles. He is old like me. He waits for... I have done what no other man on earth has ever done. I have pressed my lips to the hand of the man who killed my son." The mention of his father Peleus struck Achilles harder than any spear ever had. He realized suddenly that he would never see his father again. He realized that Peleus would soon be exactly like Priam, a grieving old man waiting for a son who would never come home. The rage, the menos, finally cracked like breaking ice. Achilles took the old king's hand and gently pushed him away, not in anger, but in shared sorrow. The two enemies sat in the tent and wept together. Priam wept for Hector. Achilles wept for his father and for Patroclus. The sound of their combined grief filled the room. For a brief, sacred moment, the war stopped. There were no Greeks or Trojans, only two broken men confronting the cruelty of mortality. Achilles stood up. He ordered his serving women to wash and anoint Hector's body. He wanted to make absolutely sure Priam didn't see the carnage he'd inflicted on the corpse, fearing the old man's anger might flare up and force Achilles to kill him, violating the sacred laws of hospitality. He lifted Hector's body onto the wagon himself. Then he did something even more surprising. He invited Priam to eat with him. They shared a meal, bread and meat, acknowledging that life must continue even in the face of death. Achilles promised a formal truce. He asked Priam how many days he needed to properly bury Hector. Priam asked for 11 days of mourning, with a burial on the 10th day and a feast on the 11th. On the 12th day, they would fight again. Achilles agreed. "I will hold back the Greek army for as long as you require." He grasped Priam's right wrist to reassure him a solemn oath. The old king slept in the enemy camp that night, safe under the protection of his son's murderer. When Priam rode back to Troy at dawn with Hector's body, the cycle of rage had been suspended. Achilles had reclaimed his humanity. He was no longer a beast or a god. He was a man again, capable of pity and empathy. But as he watched the wagon disappear over the horizon, he knew the clock was ticking. The truce would end. The war would resume. And his own time was running out fast. The truce held for exactly 11 days. The smoke from Hector's funeral pyre faded into the Aegean sky. Then, on the 12th morning, the war drums beat and the meat grinder turned back on. Achilles returned to the blood-soaked field, but he was subtly different now. The rage had cooled into a cold, grim determination. He knew with certainty he was living on borrowed time. The prophecy was specific and clear. He would die shortly after Hector. Every step he took toward the walls of Troy was a step toward his own grave. He didn't just fight local conscripts anymore. In the final phase of his short life, he fought legends. He struck down Penthesilea, the warrior queen of the Amazons who had come to Troy's aid. He slaughtered Memnon, the warrior king of Ethiopia who had come to save the city. He was systematically clearing the board, removing every obstacle between the Greeks and total victory. Finally, he did what no Greek warrior had ever done in 9 years. He breached the Scaean gates. He was inside the city. This was the moment of absolute victory. If he kept going, he would sack Troy single-handedly. But the gods have boundaries, and Achilles had crossed them all. Apollo, the divine protector of the city, stood atop the walls. He had warned Achilles once before to respect the gods. He would not warn him again. Crouched in the shadows of the gate tower was Paris. History and literature, love, irony. Paris was the complete antithesis of Achilles. He was a lover, not a fighter. He preferred perfume to blood. He fought with a bow, a weapon that, in the code of the Bronze Age warrior elite, was often viewed with open disdain. It was the weapon of the coward who dared not look his enemy in the eye. But a bow can kill a god if the aim is true. Paris drew the bowstring back. He didn't aim with practiced skill. He wasn't that good. He aimed with desperation. But he didn't need skill. Apollo, invisible to the mortals below, reached down and guided the flight of the arrow. It didn't strike Achilles in the heart or the head where armor protected. It struck him in the heel, the vulnerable tendon. Now, whether you believe the myth of the river Styx leaving his heel dry and vulnerable, or simply the medical reality that a severed Achilles tendon cripples any man instantly, the result is the same. You cannot stand You cannot charge. You cannot run. The greatest runner in the Greek army, the man they called swift-footed Achilles, was suddenly anchored to the earth. He fell. The pain would have been blinding, but the psychological shock was far worse. He wasn't dying in a glorious duel with a worthy equal. He was being picked off from a distance by the man who had started this whole catastrophic war, a man he considered beneath contempt. Paris fired again and again. Achilles crashed into the dust of the city he almost conquered. The sheer anticlimax of it stunned both armies. The invincible warlord was just meat, after all. The fight for his corpse was more vicious than the fight for the city itself. Odysseus and the giant Ajax fought back to back, holding off the entire Trojan army to retrieve Achilles' body. They refused to let the Trojans do to Achilles what Achilles had done to Hector. Ajax carried the massive body of his cousin back to the ships on his shoulders while Odysseus held off the attackers. They brought him back to the camp, but the silence was deafening. The weapon was broken. The funeral of Achilles dwarfed even Patroclus's elaborate ceremony. The muses themselves came down from Olympus to sing the funeral dirge. His mother Thetis rose from the sea with her sisters, the Nereids, their wailing echoing across the water. They built a pyre that lit up the entire shoreline. They mixed his ashes with those of Patroclus in a golden urn. Finally, in death, the two were reunited as they should have been in life, their bones mingling in the same vessel, buried under a great mound on the headland that could be seen by sailors for centuries to come. He had achieved his goal. He had traded a long life for eternal glory. He had his Kleos, his fame, but as the flames died down and the Greeks looked at the pile of ash that used to be a demigod, a haunting question remained in the air. Was it worth it? The answer wouldn't come from the living. It would come from the dead. Because the story of Achilles doesn't actually end in the dirt of Troy. It ends in the darkness of the underworld, with a final confession that changes everything we think we know about heroism and glory. The story of the Trojan War usually ends with the fall of the city, the Trojan horse, the sack, the flames. But the story of Achilles has a crucial epilogue hidden in a completely different book. Years after the war ended, Odysseus, the man who dragged Achilles out of hiding on Scyros, travels to the underworld in Homer's Odyssey. He performs a dark ritual to speak with the dead. Among the drifting shadows of the deceased, he spots the ghost of Achilles. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, tries to comfort his old friend. He tells Achilles earnestly, "Do not grieve at your death. When you were alive, we honored you like a god among men. And now that you're here in the underworld, you're a mighty prince among the dead. You have your glory. You have your Kleos. Your name will never be forgotten." Achilles' reply shatters the entire warrior code of the Bronze Age. He looks at Odysseus with infinite regret and delivers the most important line in all of Greek mythology. "Do not speak soothingly to me of death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid laborer, working for a poor man on earth, a slave to a landless peasant with nothing, than be the king of all these breathless dead." Think carefully about the profound weight of that admission. For his entire short life, Achilles sacrificed everything for fame. He gave up marriage. He gave up fatherhood. He gave up peace. He gave up old age. All for the promise that his name would be remembered forever in song. He treated life as a currency to buy immortality through legend. But now, standing on the other side of death, he realizes the fundamental scam. Being a legend is cold comfort when you don't have a body to feel the sun on your skin. He would trade all the statues, all the epic poems, all the glory, all the hero worship just to be a nobody sweating in a field, breathing fresh air, eating simple food for one more day. This is the brutal truth about Achilles. He isn't a hero to be emulated or celebrated. He is a warning written in blood. We live in a world obsessed with legacy. We're told constantly to grind, to hustle, to sacrifice our health and our relationships to make a dent in the universe. We look at billionaires working 100-hour weeks and celebrities burning out as people who have transcended the ordinary. We measure success by how we'll be remembered after we're gone, but the ghost in the underworld tells us we are wrong. The rage that drove Achilles didn't liberate him. It consumed him. The glory he bought with blood was a hollow trophy. In the end, the simple act of living, of eating bread with a friend, of feeling the rain, of holding a hand, of watching the sunset, is worth more than all the honor in the world. Achilles was the greatest killer who ever lived in Greek mythology. He was a weapon made of bronze and fire and trauma, but he only learned how to be fully human when it was too late to enjoy it. This is why his story survives 3,000 years later, not because it's aspirational, but because it's cautionary. Let's talk about the modern parallels, because they're everywhere. Achilles is the prototype for every toxic high achiever who sacrifices relationships for resume lines. He's every workaholic CEO who misses their kids' childhoods to build an empire they can't enjoy. He's every artist who destroys themselves for their art. He's every athlete who breaks their body for a trophy. He represents the fundamental mistake of confusing legacy with life. Think about child soldiers, which is essentially what Achilles was. He was raised from infancy to be a weapon. His mother literally burned him as a baby. Chiron fed him raw predator organs. He never had a childhood. He went from the cave to the battlefield. Modern child soldiers in conflicts around the world follow the same tragic pattern. Traumatized young, weaponized early, dead before they understand what life could have been. Think about PTSD and the violence Achilles witnessed and committed. The Iliad is actually one of the earliest literary depictions of combat trauma. Achilles' rage isn't just anger, it's the psychological breakdown of a man who's seen too much death. Modern veterans recognize the symptoms: hypervigilance, emotional numbness, explosive anger, inability to reintegrate into normal society. Achilles couldn't stop fighting, even when the rational choice was peace. Think about toxic masculinity and honor culture. Achilles couldn't back down from Agamemnon's insult, even though it meant watching his friends die. His pride was more important than their lives. Modern honor cultures, gang violence, revenge killings, feuds follow the same logic. Your reputation is worth more than human life. It's a value system that destroys everyone who follows it. Think about the revenge cycle that Achilles perpetuates. Agamemnon dishonors him, so he withdraws and Greeks die. Hector kills Patroclus, so Achilles kills Hector. Paris kills Achilles. Achilles' son will later kill Paris. Where does it end? It doesn't. Modern conflicts from the Middle East to gang wars in American cities follow the same pattern. Every act of violence demands retaliation, which demands counter-retaliation infinitely. Think about the glorification of violence in media. We make movies celebrating Achilles as a badass warrior. We ignore that he was a war criminal who committed human sacrifice. We do the same with modern figures celebrating soldiers, mobsters, outlaws, while ignoring the human cost of violence. We aestheticize what should horrify us. Think about the choice between fame and life that Achilles faced. Every social media influencer destroying their mental health for likes and followers is making the same choice. Every person sacrificing their present happiness for future recognition. The difference is Achilles at least achieved immortal fame. Most people making this trade-off won't even get that. Think about the Briseis situation and how we treat women as prizes. Briseis had no agency in the Iliad. She was property to be distributed to men as a reward. Her feelings about being captured, enslaved, and passed between warriors are never explored. Modern conflicts still treat women as spoils of war. The fundamental dehumanization continues. Think about Patroclus as the collateral damage of Achilles' ego. Patroclus died because Achilles was too proud to fight himself, but too proud to let the Greeks lose. Modern wars are full of people dying for someone else's pride, soldiers dying for politicians' egos, civilians caught in conflicts about abstract principles. Think about the Priam scene as the moment empathy breaks through. Two enemies, recognizing their shared humanity, their shared grief. It's the moment that should have happened at the beginning, recognizing that Trojans and Greeks are all just humans who want to live. Modern conflicts desperately need more Priam moments, humanizing the enemy, seeing the father in the soldier. Think about Achilles' final regret in Hades. It echoes the regrets of dying people everywhere. No one on their deathbed says, "I wish I'd worked more," or "I wish I'd been more famous." They wish they'd spent more time with loved ones, appreciated simple pleasures, lived more fully. Achilles learns this lesson after death, when it's useless. But what about the archaeological reality behind the myth? The Trojan War probably happened around 1200 BC, during the Bronze Age collapse, a period when Mediterranean civilizations mysteriously collapsed. Troy Hisarlik, in modern Turkey, was a real city destroyed multiple times. Bronze Age warfare was as brutal as Homer describes. Warriors really did wear boar tusk helmets. They really did fight with bronze weapons that bent. The Mycenaean Greeks really did raid coastal cities. So while Achilles himself is mythological, he represents real Bronze Age warriors. And the human sacrifice he commits? Archaeological evidence suggests it really happened in Bronze Age Greece. We've found skeletons of young people killed ritually and buried with warriors. The horror Homer describes was real. The Iliad isn't just mythology, it's a window into how Bronze Age people understood war, honor, and death. But why does the Achilles story still resonate after 3,000 years? Because the central conflict is timeless. The tension between what we want, recognition, glory, to matter, and what we need, connection, love, to live. Achilles chose what he wanted over what he needed, and he regrets it for eternity. Every generation rediscovers this lesson. The Victorians saw Achilles as the noble warrior. The World War I generation saw him as the young man sent to die for old men's pride. The Vietnam generation saw him as the soldier trapped in an unwinnable war. We see him as the high achiever, burning out for success that won't satisfy. The story adapts because the core truth doesn't change. Glory is empty. Life is precious. Don't confuse the two. Let's also talk about what the Iliad doesn't say but implies: Briseis' perspective. She was a princess of Lyrnessus. Achilles sacked her city, killed her husband and brothers, and took her as a slave. Then Agamemnon took her. Then she was given back to Achilles. At no point does anyone ask what she wants. Imagine her trauma, watching her city burn, her family murdered, being passed between her captors like property. The Iliad treats her as an object in Achilles' story, but she was a person with her own story of survival and suffering. Modern retellings like The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker finally give her a voice. They remind us that every war has civilian casualties whose stories are erased. Achilles is the protagonist of the Iliad, but he's the villain of Briseis' story. Perspective matters. Think about Hector's family, his wife Andromache watching from the walls as her husband runs for his life, then watching his body dragged through the dirt. His infant son Astyanax, who will later be thrown from the walls by the Greeks to prevent him from growing up to seek revenge. His parents watching their son's corpse desecrated. Every story of military glory has a shadow story of grief. Think about the ordinary soldiers. The Iliad focuses on heroes, but thousands of unnamed men died in that war. Farmers conscripted to row ships across the Aegean. Fishermen forced to fight for kings they'd never met. Young men who just wanted to go home. Achilles killed hundreds of them. They had families, dreams, fears. They're the real victims, not the heroes who chose glory. Think about the environmental destruction. 9 years of armies camping on the Trojan plain, cutting down forests for ships and siege equipment and funeral pyres, stripping the land of resources, polluting the rivers with bodies. Ancient warfare was ecological disaster. The scars lasted generations. Think about the economic cost. Troy was a wealthy trading city. Its destruction disrupted Bronze Age trade networks. The siege cost the Greek kingdoms enormous resources, ships, weapons, supplies for 100,000 men for a decade. The Trojan War probably contributed to the Bronze Age collapse that destroyed Mediterranean civilization. Wars have costs beyond the battlefield. Think about the religious dimension. Ancient Greeks really believed the gods intervened in battles. They fought wars as religious acts. Achilles sacrificing 12 boys wasn't just murder. It was piety in his worldview. Understanding how religion motivates violence helps us understand modern religious conflicts. People do terrible things when they believe God is on their side. Think about the class dimension. Achilles could choose between glory and life because he was aristocracy. The common soldiers had no choice, they were conscripted. Honor culture only applies to the elite. Poor soldiers die for rich men's honor. This pattern continues in modern wars where elites send working-class kids to fight. Think about the disability of Achilles' death. Shot in the heel by the least impressive warrior. Not a glorious duel. Not a heroic last stand. Just an arrow from the shadows. Most combat deaths aren't glorious. They're random, sudden, meaningless. We mythologize war to hide its fundamental absurdity. Think about the generational trauma. Achilles was traumatized by his mother. He traumatized everyone around him. His son Neoptolemus became even more brutal. He's the one who killed Priam on an altar and threw baby Astyanax from the walls. Trauma passes down. Hurt people. Breaking the cycle requires choosing differently. Think about the alternative Achilles rejected. What if he'd stayed on Syros, married one of those princesses, raised children in peace, died old? His name would be forgotten, but he would have lived. Is that worse? The answer depends on whether you value being or being remembered. Ancient Greeks valued being remembered. Modern therapy says value being. Achilles represents the ancient view. His regret in Hades suggests maybe the ancients got it wrong. Think about the problem of male role models. Boys are still given Achilles as a hero. Be like Achilles, strong, fearless, undefeated. But Achilles was miserable. His strength isolated him. His fearlessness was trauma response. His military success brought only grief. We need better role models than traumatized killers. Think about the friend versus lover debate. Were Achilles and Patroclus lovers? Ancient Greeks thought so. They debated who was the Erastes, older lover, and Eromenos, younger beloved. Modern scholars argue. But it misses the point. Their bond was the one genuine relationship in Achilles' life. Whether sexual or not, it was love. And its loss destroyed him. Think about Achilles' shield, symbolism. Hephaestus put the whole world on it. Cities at peace and war, farmers harvesting, young people dancing. Achilles carried a reminder of everything he couldn't have. It's heartbreaking. He fought while literally carrying the life he sacrificed. Do we do the same? Carry reminders of the lives we're not living while we chase success? Think about the function of rage. Menos, cosmic wrath, destroyed Achilles' humanity, but it also gave him power. Anger can be fuel. The question is, what are you fueling? Achilles used rage to kill. Others use anger at injustice to create change. MLK's righteous anger. Greta Thunberg's climate rage. Anger isn't inherently bad, it's how you direct it. Achilles directed his toward destruction. Think about the prophecy as self-fulfilling. Achilles knew he'd die at Troy. Did that knowledge make him reckless? Did believing he was fated to die make him careless about survival? Modern soldiers who believe they're going to die become more reckless. Fatalism can be self-fulfilling. Believing you have no choice removes agency. Think about the Immortality Project. terror management theory says humans cope with mortality awareness by pursuing symbolic immortality through children, art, fame. Achilles chose fame. It's the same impulse that drives artists, leaders, anyone trying to leave a mark. But the theory suggests it's a defense mechanism against existential terror, not a path to meaning. Think about Thetis's tragedy. She was immortal. She knew her son would die. She had to watch him choose death. Imagine that helplessness. Parents watching children make self-destructive choices. She tried to save him, hiding him on Syros. But you can't save someone from themselves. Every parent of an addict, a soldier, a depressed child, understands Thetis's grief. Think about the function of epic poetry. The Iliad was performed orally for centuries before being written. Why? To preserve cultural values. It taught Greek boys about honor, combat, glory. It justified war. It was propaganda and art. Modern war movies do the same. Glorify combat, recruit soldiers, shape culture. We should ask what values our stories are teaching. Think about the contrast with the Odyssey. Odysseus spends 10 years trying to get home to his wife. He chooses life over glory repeatedly. He's the counterpoint to Achilles. One chose death and glory. One chose life and homecoming. Homer gave us both options. We tend to celebrate Achilles more. Why? What does that say about us? Think about the archaeological evidence of Bronze Age violence. Skeletons from this era show evidence of brutal trauma, axe wounds, spear damage, mass graves of young men. The Iliad's violence isn't exaggerated. If anything, it understates the horror. War has always been hell. Think about the legacy industry. Achilles has a legacy, 3,000 years of fame, but he can't enjoy it. Legacy is for other people, not you. Jeff Bezos building rockets, Elon Musk colonizing Mars. They're building legacies, but they won't be around to see them matter. Is that worth sacrificing your present? Achilles says no. Think about the moment with the horse. When his immortal horse prophesies his death, Achilles says, I know. He's aware. He's choosing this consciously. That makes it more tragic. He's not deluded. He sees clearly and chooses death anyway. Why? Because glory matters more to him than life. Can we understand that choice even if we wouldn't make it? Think about Achilles as disabled at the end. The heel wound cripples him. The greatest runner can't run. The best warrior can't fight. Disability can strike anyone. It strips identity. If you base your worth on physical ability, what happens when you lose it? Achilles had no identity beyond warrior. When he couldn't fight, he was nothing. Think about the alternative stories we could tell. What if we celebrated the Greek soldier who survived the war and went home? The Trojan who evacuated his family before the city fell? The person who chose life? We don't, because survival isn't glorious. But maybe it should be. Maybe living well is the real achievement. So what's the final lesson of Achilles? It's this. You are not your achievements. You are not your reputation. You are not your legacy. You are a human being with one life. The question isn't how will I be remembered? It's, am I living? Achilles answered that question wrong. He sacrificed living for being remembered, and in death, he realized his mistake. Don't make the same error. The modern world sells you the Achilles bargain constantly. Work yourself to death for success. Sacrifice relationships for career. Choose hustle over happiness. The reward? Maybe you'll be remembered. Maybe you'll matter. But Achilles, speaking from the grave, tells you the truth. It's not worth it. Better to be unknown and alive than famous and dead. Better to eat bread with people you love than to have a statue in a city you'll never see. Better to feel the sun one more time than to have epic poems sung about you. This is why Homer ends the Achilles story in the underworld. It's a warning. Glory is a lie. Life is the truth. Choose accordingly. The Iliad isn't a celebration of war. It's a meditation on its cost. The Odyssey isn't about adventure. It's about coming home. Together, they offer a complete picture. Glory costs everything and gives nothing back. Home is what matters. Achilles learned this too late. You don't have to. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Greek mythology and want to explore more history without the Hollywood filter, smash that subscribe button for Map Room Battles and turn on notifications. I have videos coming on Odysseus, Hector, and the real archaeology of Troy that you won't want to miss. And let me know, in the comments, if you were given Achilles' choice, a short, glorious life remembered forever, or a long, quiet life, forgotten by history, which would you honestly choose? Would you trade years for fame, or would you choose what Achilles wishes he'd chosen life? Thank you for watching. Remember, the past is a mirror. Achilles' regret is your warning. You have one life. The question isn't how you'll be remembered. It's whether you're actually living. Don't wait until death to realize what mattered. Choose now. Choose life over legacy. Choose bread with friends over bronze statues. Choose the sunset over the song. Choose to be the peasant in the field rather than the king of the dead. That's the brutal truth about Achilles. The greatest warrior who ever lived would trade all his glory for one more ordinary day. Don't make his mistake.